Hello and welcome to another Tippling Philosopher video. And this time we're going to talk not philosophy, but we will include some philosophy. Not psychology, but we will include psychology. Certainly a lot of politics and quite a bit of, sadly, war and, existential threats. But there you go. That's what it's like to live in this month. We're going to talk about the Ukraine-Russian or the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or Russian-Ukraine war. I don't know what it'll be called in the future, because that is on the minds of everyone at the moment, and for a lot of good reason. Because this is an insanely impactful global conflict that is involving the globe, even though it's involving ostensibly two countries in war only, but by proxy an awful lot of other countries. Anyway, that's all the stuff that we can talk about. It's all very interesting, but super important, as I say. I wanted this to be far more structured than it probably will be, because unfortunately I've only just got back from the north of England, where I was with one of my boys doing some ice skating competition. So I do apologize. So it'll probably be quite free ranging. I've got my mate Rob on from the Tippling Philosophers. Rob, welcome. Thank you for joining in with this political conversation.
Good to be here. Thanks, Johnny.
Excellent.
I've come with my my new philosophy mug someone gave me today.
I might look like I'm listening to you, but in my head I'm thinking about philosophy. Brilliant. I love it. I love that. And which is very you, is very me. That is
thanks, Johnny.
Is what we do when Rob and I famously
we don't listen to people. Yeah.
No. When we go down the pub, we have this and to meet each other after however long without seeing each other. We have this awesome period of we'll get down there and we'll chat for 2 hours about like hardcore philosophy straight away. Go straight into philosophy and psychology and this and that, and then we'll go, oh, how the family? How are you? What's going on in your life? And that's how we roll, because that's how cool we are. Anyway, so I don't know if anyone will bother tuning in to watch this, but people can watch it obviously not live as well. So we're going to talk about. First of all, we'll be discussing the nature of the whole conflict and how it came to be. We'll talk about what Putin's end game was and is now. The whole plethora of incredibly bad decisions I think that have been made, and then we move more generally to talk about sort of psychology of war, and and also where do we go from here, and the psychology of war, because I know Rob has some interest in linking this to sort of Jungian psychology. But I suppose to just sort of start talking about the whole conflict now, it's worth just talking a little bit about, because I think it sets a scene about 2014, what happened all the way back in 2014, and how that played a part in where we are now. And I also wanted to have a little discussion, Rob, about balancing coverage of this and the idea that, are we in the West covering this in our media as fairly and appropriately as possible, or is it just sort of rallying around the Ukrainian flag? And I think that's interesting, and I've moved several directions on that, but I think we'll come to that. So before we start, what do you have any opening remarks? I've done a lot of talking, but do you have any opening remarks?
Yeah, I just it's something actually I put on my post I did earlier on, is the thought that actually part of the nature of war, very quickly it kind of forces us into, by definition almost, in and out groups, and to the point where I think you almost, if you try and look at something dispassionately, you're going to be seen probably by both sides kind of as what's the word, a kind of traitor, really. The kind of, if you try and take a kind of philosophical view and try and be fair and go, well, let's try and really at least understand both sides of this, and it may well be, and I think it probably is the case, that Putin's a pretty nasty piece of work, and that there's a bit of a thug and all the rest of it, and that the whole conflict, I mean, my sympathies lie with the Ukrainians, as I'm sure yours do as well. But it's just that, I guess, as a philosopher, and I guess trying to think of things objectively, it's the difficulty of looking at things a bit dispassionately. But I think it's part of the nature of war is that we get pulled into the kind of tribal in and out groups, where even just to raise the question of, is this being looked at fairly? Should we look at what the other side are saying? Can be seen as something that's kind of, well, that's crossing a line. That's, of course we're on the right side,
you would link this to kind of I know you would, because that sounds almost very similar to like your position on woke liberal sort of philosophizing and moralizing
or polarization,
but yeah,
I suppose.
So let's just do a little bit of a history, which is to say, right, 2014 Crimea happened, which is where Ukraine, Crimea was within the sovereign boundaries of Ukraine. Ukraine was a former Soviet republic, or part of the Soviet Union, and when it was that, it was known as the Ukraine, as a kind of just a geographic region, but it had its own identity, of course, as regions do, and it became an independent sovereign state. Now, what happened is that Ukraine did have a pro-Russian, democratically elected pro-Russian leader, but there were these Euromaidan protests that took place, partly or largely because the pro-Russian president stopped with some trade talks with the EU. And so the pro-EU Ukrainians were not very happy with this. The pro-democratic, Western-looking Ukrainians were not happy with this. And as a result, there were huge amounts of protests. And people like politicians from America, McCain, for example, came over and was literally going to the protest, standing, making speeches. And so there was some involvement with Western sort of politicians and political institutions, but also involvement with things like the IMF that said, we'll give you a load of money if you privatize this and do that. So there's some sort of capitalism encroaching into Ukraine. And there was this agreement supposedly with the Soviet Union, as it was, that NATO wouldn't sort of encroach, it wouldn't go past East Germany. But of course, that was an agreement with the Soviet Union, which ceased to exist as a country, and so therefore, you can't really say that as a promise. And then actually, it was not as obvious as the promise not to do that. So you get some people from the pro-Russia side saying, actually, NATO really encroached, promised not to encroach, and the pro-NATO people saying, actually, that wasn't a genuine promise, and actually that was an agreement with the Soviet Union and this and that. And anyway, point being that the Ukraine has become a political football between Russia, as is now, and with Putin at the helm, possibly looking to reignite some sense of the USSR, and the West and NATO and the EU. And in being a political football, I think part of the problem is we see it as a political football, which is to say, we should maybe stop seeing it in terms of what it is to Russia and what it is to the West, but actually give the people some kind of self-determination to say what they want to be. And if they had democratically had protests, and of course the protests are going to be, there's going to be money coming from America in the same way that there's money coming from Russia, which is the eastern side of Ukraine and Crimea, being more pro-Russia. That's part of the Cold War and the leftover remnants of the Cold War. But it's complex. Of course it's complex. But at the end of the day, the pro-Russian leader sort of ran away. It wasn't quora anymore, the government. So they basically, he was not fit for purpose. It was kind of, got rid of, but not in any kind of sinister way. and a democratic government is instituted, and there we are, and here we are, and this was a sovereign nation, and the protests led by the people led to this sovereign nation existing. Anyway, 2014 comes along, and Russia decide to, just after this, Russia says, "Oh, we're gonna walk into Crimea and take this." And part of the problem is that the West did really not a lot about this. So when you've got a sort of bullying person coming in and saying, "I'm going to go and do this," and the rest of the world doesn't really react robustly to that, then it kind of effectively condones what that person does. Does this all make sense so far? I'm butchering.
Yeah.
So he goes in and does that, and then the West really doesn't do a lot to this. There's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. And so, 8 years, and you've got Putin with this whole mindset, obviously thinking, well, I've done that. They did nothing. So I might as well go and do this. And they're broadly going to do nothing. So he then has this plan, because as the Ukraine starts cozying up with NATO and starts cozying up with the EU, and this is his boundary. This is almost the buffer between the Russia and the EU, partly. He sees a threat of Europe and a threat of NATO overcoming one of his sort of boundary nations, and this really gets him. So Putin, we know he sees Ukraine as a territory. I don't think this has anything to do with uniting the peoples in some kind of cultural unison. And we know that he's paranoid, and we know he's deeply, deeply afraid of how long it takes a missile to get to Moscow. So a nuclear missile and also a non-nuclear missile. And he's always talking about the time. And if Ukraine is taken over by the West, then that missile time goes down to like 5 minutes. And he's obsessed with that. So there's all sorts of things going on, where he then decides to say, right, I think this is what the original decision was. I'm going to depose the Ukrainian leadership and replace them, the government, and replace them with a pro-Russian government. It'll be a three-day operation, special operation that we've done elsewhere. We're going to do that. Go in there, 3 days, bish bash bosh, come out with a pro-Russian government. And it didn't happen. But in a very butchered sense, would that be how you understand what's happened?
Yeah, I think that's the way I see it. And I think we both watched that really interesting video you shared. Vlad
Vexler, who's a philosopher who's analysed Putin and the situation. It's particularly good. I'll put a link to that.
Just the way that he has that kind of concern for territory, but also that deep paranoia, and it's interesting for me as well, just thinking how we think of what insight it gives us into him. The way that he sees the US, for example, if he's paranoid about the US, he can't trust anybody. He thinks they're going to put nukes on his border and all the rest of it. That from a kind of Jungian point of view, not that I'm particularly solely a Jungian, but it's just interested me this week, particularly looking at it through that lens. That sometimes you see, the adage we've got in our culture, it takes one to know one. That we actually work our understanding of other people very often based on our own mindset. So we imagine other people are like us. So the fact that he's kind of paranoid about the Americans, that he can't trust anyone, that people always have deep, dark Machiavellian motives, probably tells you that's what he's like. That actually this is how he sees other people, because this is what he's like. So I think that's interesting to think of in terms of what we're dealing with.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that, and we know that he is paranoid, and we know, I mean, there's an awful lot of detail on this, so you can find it out there, about how he sees everything as like a threat from the West or America, and this kind of going back to the old Cold War sort of status. Especially, you got to understand, he's been brought up in that, he's been in the KGB, etc., etc., etc. So he's deeply almost conspiracy theory laden as a person, with what other people are doing and their machinations, which says probably what you're saying is that says a lot about, or he's like that. He has all these machinations and he sees the West in that same mirrored way. So therefore he's projecting himself onto the West or Western leaders.
Yeah, in that sense I got from Vlad's video, just really just probably very few people are trusting anybody inside the Kremlin, that it's quite a viper's nest.
Well, I imagine it's been that way, you know, for since, you know, for a good 100 years. And I think so. It's a very interesting scenario because you wonder why now? Why now? Well, here's an interesting situation where Angela Merkel, who was a very strong, consistent German chancellor, is now no longer in charge of Germany, which from the outsider makes you think, one, Germany's weak, two, Europe's weak. And if the EU are weak, now's your time. Because if NATO, Article 5 of NATO says, if you attack one NATO country, you attack us all. So therefore, war on one is war on us all. So if Ukraine ever became part of NATO, he couldn't attack it because it would be World War III. So if they are cozying up with the EU and NATO with a view to joining, then he needs to get in there quickly because it's now or never. But also, Scholz is in charge of Germany and things look a bit fractious and it's not as solid as when Merkel's in charge, and therefore the EU's not as solid. So this is a perfect time to attack. Get in there. We know that no one really united when Putin says, when I went into Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk on the east, no one really did much. There was a few sanctions, easy peasy. Look where we are now, as if nothing really happened. And then I can walk in, depose the government, job done, and I can get rid of this tangible threat of missiles being close by, and this kind of more existential threat of having a Western nation like giving a bit of a shining light to Belarus and all these other places within the purview of Russia's sphere of influence. So I think this gives you some kind of understanding of why it happened now.
I think also probably Brexit, which has probably been partly engineered by. It'd be interesting to. I think someone's post I saw earlier on. It'd be interesting to look at Farage and UKIP and what Russian money was involved in all of that. But
Aaron Banks, who funded a lot of the Leave campaign, had ties to Russia. Yeah, big time.
And also, I guess, with the timing, with the change with the Biden administration and the pullout of Afghanistan, these were all kind of, I think various people I've listened to are saying he's been watching this for years, planning something like it for a long time, and kind of the stars aligned in terms of his interpreted kind of weakness on the part of the West, and probably got it badly wrong, and I think has probably achieved precisely the opposite in every one of his objectives.
And we'll come on to that in a second. You're absolutely right, like dead right. I think, as Richard Williams says in the live chat, Putin wants to go down in history as a guy who started World War III. I wouldn't say that, but I would say legacy to Putin is probably super important, as it is to most humans in some kind of way. You think, I want my life to have meaning. And especially if you're in charge of a country, that's got to be even more. I mean, if we think in our normal lives here, doing whatever we do, right? For me, I write books and I write articles and I do YouTube videos. In some sense, because it is a legacy. It is like, this is my stamp on the world, and this is me like having some kind of meaning and being able to impart my meaning onto others, so that if I die now, there's some part of me that exists. Maybe that's not in the front of my mind, but that is something that is interesting. Would you agree with that as a psychology?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was just, as you were saying that, I was thinking of all the leaders in history that have wanted cities named after themselves. And Victoria, Queenstown, Georgetown, all the kind of Greeks that did that. I guess can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's been part of history, isn't it? People wanting to somehow set something in stone that the sands of time won't engulf.
I suppose the question, if you're the sort of person that wants to become and becomes an authoritarian leader, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Lenin, Stalin, any of these huge Pol Pots, I know I'm choosing really negative people here, arguably, but there must be something in you that is authoritarian, wanting the world to be like, or your people to be like you want them to be, stamping your authority, but also hungering after power and needing, that feeds into that kind of narcissism maybe that many people claim that Putin has. But if you're the sort of person that wants to be that kind of leader, then something like a legacy probably fits in really well, rather than Jim that goes down a pub every Friday night and is happy, to squander his money on a few pints on a Friday evening. And
and I think, and I guess that there's probably that element of the fusion of. I mean, we don't know. We're guessing, but it's probably a good bet that his own personal sense of identity, like it is for all of us, we belong to a group. And we kind of identify with whatever group it is that we belong to. If you're a pro-European, you might see yourself as a kind of Europhile, or if you're Brexiteer, you might, etc., etc. But sometimes for people, I think that sense of who I am is so fused with the group identity that the group identity, or the national project, if you like, has to succeed, because somehow I'm caught up with it, it's caught up with me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you've talked about this in terms of war before, and, talking about Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, and like when you talk about people who jump on a hand grenade, is it because they're being truly altruistic, or is it because they see their platoon as them, as a oneness? And then, and I know that's slightly different to what we're talking about, what you were just talking about, but the idea of the kind of blurring of lines between the individual and the collective, that means when you're making decisions, I don't know where I'm going with that.
I guess I was thinking of it in the sense of, I mean, we all have a sense of belonging to something. No one's a complete sort of isolated island. It's inevitable. We all have that, but it's, to what extent is it that our own ego is kind of fragilely connected to the storyline of our culture? So the decline of Russia is felt extremely kind of personally by someone like Putin. He's like, it's almost like, the decline of, it's like he's caught up, I imagine, in this kind of the history, the grandeur of Tsarist Russia. Because he's not even, he was in the KGB. It's not even the sort of loyalty to the Soviet era. It's Russia. It's the Tsarist imperial past as well as the Soviet era. It's just the greatness of Russia and wanting to be part of something great. I guess that when we kind of feel ourselves to be part of something greater than ourselves, then it gives us, again, not just that sense of immortality that he might be after, but that sense of transcendence. I am part of something great, and therefore I am great.
Yeah, and that sense of legacy he wants to make, as West 501 said in the comments there, wants to make Russia great again. He's like, it's not MAGA, it's Murga.
Yeah.
There will almost certainly be that sense, and we know as well, or I say we know, that there is good evidence to suggest he's also a really emotional person. You might not think so for like an authoritarian leader, but that means that he can make pretty emotional decisions. He gets really angry, or so on and so forth, or so he's not often the most rational. He's all of these things that we've just been talking about, all wrapped up in one. You've got the narcissism, you've got the desire for legacy, you've got him being linked to the history of his nation, and his conspiracy theory thinking, where he doesn't trust anyone, and that's why he's actually got a really. So back in the kind of Soviet era, you had big Politburo and like decision making. Like, I think Putin is far more of an authoritarian leader, single person leadership than than you've seen in previous Russian history. And I think, and there's talk that he's only got very few people around him. He's actually retreated since COVID back into his own kind of palace or wherever, and he doesn't come out as much as he used to. And all these kind of things lead to like a really interesting scenario that can go part way to explaining what has happened, which is that he's made some pretty shocking decisions.
It's interesting. Do you remember that article I sent on to you once? I think there was it's in the Lancet, people can look it up, but it was looking at, it's just come to mind now, the connection between authoritarian government and parasites in the blood. So when there's a kind of a plague or some kind of pandemic, and this would happen entirely at an unconscious level, the body sending signals and kicking something off that makes us want to pull the tribal boundaries in more tightly, get more centralized leadership, keep the other tribe out, because I guess they could be carriers of the parasites, So when there's a contagion of some sort, that nationalism and tribalism is far more likely to steamroll ahead and to kind of the volume to get boosted.
That reminds me of there's linkage between behaviors and incidents of toxoplasmic gondii, I think it is, or this particular kind of similar sort of thing that you can get that makes your behavior really erratic and all linked to free will. Anyway, that was another. I won't go down that one, but yeah. So then we get the situation where, for a whole bunch of reasons, or for whatever reason, Putin says, right, we're gonna rush into to Ukraine, and we are going to depose the government, and it's going to be easy, and it's going to be a 3-5 day thing. And we kind of know this because early doors, the Russian troops were running out of fuel and food, and they only had food to last them for 5 days, 3 to 5 days, which only makes any sense if, and the Russians weren't told what they were doing. A lot of the soldiers were said, you're going on training to Donetsk or whatever, the Donbass, and you're just going on training mission. Turns out, actually, no, you're not. You're going to be, here's some live rounds. We'll have your phones, please, and blah, blah, blah. So they weren't really told what it was always, fairly secretive and then fairly quick looking, as in also quite rushed in the planning. And there's a lot of reasons to suggest it's quite rushed. But of course, this didn't happen because the thing is, the whole of Ukraine was not wanting this, right? So they would. A lot of the Russian soldiers were told that they'll be welcomed with open arms, right? And they weren't. Now, my question is, did Putin and the commanders think that they were going to be welcomed with open arms? Was that kind of propaganda to their soldiers? Or did they genuinely think that that was the case? And if they genuinely thought that was the case, what intelligence is Putin and the command? What intelligence are they getting? Because that's terrible.
Yeah. Or and or kind of what relationship is there between his closest advisors? What are people able to tell him that they feel he will actually listen to? People just think best not to just say anything. He just wants yes men around him, as it were.
Yeah, and there's supposedly that's a fairly accurate appraisal. He's KGB. He's not military, and so he's not very good at making military decisions by the looks of it. And when you look at places like, so when they've got involved in other places around the world, like Syria and Georgia, what they've done is literally they have been pretty special operations, which is go in 3 days, or they've been operating where you haven't got people fighting back that hard. So what happened in Syria is they bombed the crap out of Aleppo and all these places with aerial bombardments because they had no anti-aircraft guns and stuff like that. So they had free rein to just basically do what they like. Now, what happened in 2014 is the Ukrainians had really crap armaments because they were pretty much exactly the same as the Russians in that kind of era of armament. And so Russia was able to go in there with consummate ease. But what happened after that, and again, NATO involvement, is that their army got trained by British, American, blah, blah, blah. Army got trained up. They had shed loads of investment in arms. And in fact, Ukraine is the 4th biggest recipient of US defense spending. So, you know, that's a lot of money. And they'd spent 8 years getting absolutely sorted out, modernized it in the air, on the ground, with all sorts of stuff. And so when Russia then goes in again, thinking of, oh, Crimea was easy, they go in again. And of course, if they'd had decent intelligence, you'd know that A, the whole country doesn't want you there, apart from maybe a few in the east and down in Crimea. And B, they're going to be a lot tougher than they were 8 years ago. And that's exactly what happened. So they sent him in. Now, here's the thing. I've been absolutely addicted, as you know, because I've been posting it all over my Facebook the whole time, addicted to a Twitter account called Ukraine Weapons Tracker. So I can tell you, like, about 20 times a day, I get updates of exactly what hardware has been captured, mainly from the Ukrainians, and what scenarios you've had. And you've had Russian soldiers that have been captured who are then telling you what's going on, how demoralized they were, just walking away from their equipment. You've got equipment that's run out of fuel. You've got equipment that's got stuck in the boggy mud, which they should know because it's quite famous from the Second World War era and onwards. They've got supply lines are completely screwed. Every army commander should know that it's all about your supply lines. Your army is only as good as your supply lines, etc., etc., etc. All of these situations, the Russian equipment is absolutely crap. Like it's rusting. I saw tanks where they're looking inside and they're literally wooden planks for seats. Like they just like. And inside, they're all just not kitted out at all. And then you compare the Ukrainian tanks, some that have been captured, and they're kitted out with a full Western, like, modernized equipment. You look at the ones inside the Russian, and it's like they look like they're from the Second World War. It's just the difference in the equipment is phenomenal, and the Russians are losing it hand over fist. You know, every day they're just walking away, getting stuck, running out of fuel, breaking down. And their equipment is just falling by the roadside, quite literally, every day. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. It beggars belief in terms of the sort of the command and control structure. I was listening to a guy, I can't remember who it was now, just talking about how, you know, any kind of land campaign that you would organise like that, you would organise your you know, in a kind of hierarchical way, kind of main battle groups, you know, regiments, divisions. I'm not a military, so I don't know the exact ones, but, you know, then your units and subunits, because you need to have real kind of an ability to kind of command and control and send different units and subunits and then responding clear lines of command. And what they've done is they've brought in troops from all across Russia, lots of conscripts. I don't even know if they're from the same kind of units even, and from what you've said, I think earlier on as well, that these guys didn't even know they were going in there. They were just doing some sort of exercise, had their phones taken off them, and complete chaos basically. And the worrying thing for me, I think, is like in a way, you don't want Russia to go in and take over Ukraine, but if you're going to have a war and if there's going to be an outcome, really you want it to be quick and clean as possible.
Yeah,
you know, you want it to be done with the least bloodshed and harm possible, and to do that you have to be very well organized. You have to have a really good strong troop to population ratio. I think there was a video you shared, but I've watched as well, this CIA and various other ex-Pentagon type people. That's the one, and saying, I don't know whether it was in Serbia, they had like 90 troops to every 1,000 population. The Russians have got something like 3 to 4 soldiers for every 1,000 population. And so, you know, you want to, if you're going to do it cleanly. But the worry is that if they're doing it like this, it's not like they're going to give up. I don't think the Russians are going to give up. So what's you're going to look like is you're going to have a complete ongoing bloodbath.
So because they thought it was going to be a 3 to 5 day thing and then it'll be over, they didn't really put too much thought into it. So they didn't go. So normally when you're going to invade somewhere, you want complete air superiority. They didn't get air superiority to begin with. And then they started, think of the Battle of Britain. I mean, going back to 1940 and Hitler wanting to invade the UK. Well, he knew he had to win in the air, because if you don't win in the air, when you move all your ships and troops across, you're going to get hit from the air and obliterated. So, and he lost that and therefore didn't invade. Well, here Putin has invaded without air superiority, and as a result, there's and when you've got like loads of drones, like the Ukrainians have got a shed load of Turkish drones that are doing a really devastating job, but they've also still got air. I wouldn't call it superiority, but it's contested, and the Russians are losing fixed wing airplanes and helicopters by the dozen, and they're getting shot down from the air, but also from the defenses on the ground. And if that's the case, so I saw a video today of an artillery, a whole spread out artillery unit. And the first thing was they're all spread out in a line. Well, you don't spread artillery out in a line because you can just blast them down in a line, and it's just really easy. So you kind of dot them around. And the other thing is you have troops in front of them to give covering fire and all that. Well, what I was seeing today is that this was out in the countryside. They had this artillery batteries, bunch of artillery, obviously shelling some city, but there were no troops in front of them because the troops are just sticking to the roads. And it's not like an advance of an army. It's just not an invasion. It wasn't an invasion, but because they failed in that 3 to 5 day thing, it has become an invasion. But because it hasn't had the forethought of an invasion, and like you were talking, to occupy a country, is a very different thing from going to deposing a government and basically just keeping a few people around to make sure everyone's doing what they're expected to. But you've got a pro-Russian government in place that's doing the hard work. That didn't happen. So literally everyone hates them, and they're left now with, as you keep hearing, no off-ramp. Putin has no off-ramp. He needs an off-ramp. Do you want to explain what an off-ramp might mean in this context?
An off-ramp, I've not heard that before. I'm assuming you mean a kind of like, let's not put him in a corner, he needs a way out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is, sorry, I just thought I'd been talking too much, so I'd let you just talk. But an off-ramp is a way out, right? So a way out that because again, this is going to be very personal now. He's this authoritarian leader who's used to winning X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 and used to having all that power, goes in, bungles it, then feels, right, I can't just go, oh, sorry about that. That was really rubbish. Everyone come out. Oh, we made a really big mistake. Sorry, my bad. Never going to happen. So it's like, right, I'm in. It's gone wrong. I've got to get in deeper. This is like classic gambling, like chasing good money with bad, which is right. Okay, can't cut my losses. So how do I win now? And of course, there is no winning now. There is no off ramp. There's no way out of this because he can't win. He literally can't win without. The only way he can now win is obliterating the country and flattening it.
I was just
sorry, it just
lost your signal.
It froze.
I can hear you again.
It froze for a bit.
Obliterating.
Yeah, so the only way he can win is by flattening the country, right? So he was going to go in, depose them. That didn't happen. They all want to remain part of this sovereign nation, apart from a few people in the east and down in Crimea, which is already broadly contested anyway. But the rest of the country don't want Russian rule. So what do you do? How do you win that? What's his end game? He can't change a government. But he's had to change his end game.
And I imagine the big pressure probably for him, given what that Vlad guy was saying to me the other day, is actually it's his strength or weakness within the Kremlin that's at stake. It's not particularly Russia itself. So, if he doesn't continue this or come out with a face-saving position, I mean, how is he going to look like a viable leader? It's the knives are going to be out, aren't they?
This is a really good point. So the best hope for the West, for the Ukrainians, sorry, not the West, is the Ukrainians. The best hope for the Ukrainians is for him to be deposed himself. So either a military coup or to have so many protests within Russia and Belarus that it's just, and for the sanctions to bite so deep and so hard that he is got rid of. I mean, he's not going to step down, but it takes some other people around him to get rid of him, and that is really the only way out, because he has no option. There is. I mean, what do you do if I can't have a government in charge, and I've now actually shelled most of these cities so much that they are, the economic benefit of ruling this place is now going to cost that. If he was to run it, it would cost him to rebuild it. So he just cannot win with what he's doing. So this is only a matter of pride. And wow, the death that's being involved. I mean, the Ukrainians say over 11,000 soldiers, and yeah, that's going to be propaganda. But I would probably guess I've seen a lot of dead soldiers on videos that are just pretty horrible. But I've seen hundreds and hundreds of pieces of hardware that have been either obliterated or given up or captured, and the deaths have to be nearer the Ukrainian end than the Russian end. So I don't know where he goes.
Just coming back, I just going to remember, just so I remember where maybe to come back on this. And the question I might come back to in a second is, so the harder we push on sanctions and the harder we push, what effect does that have on the paranoia, and then the kind of how that spreads in terms of national unity as well, and perhaps spreading that misinformation and that paranoia. That's where we pick up in a second. It's your show, John. I just wondered, in terms of if people are doing a super chat, do we want to donate that money to anything?
I don't know if anyone has super chatted, or no one has super chatted, but if we do, I'm willing. That's a really good point. I'd be willing to donate money towards Disaster and Emergencies Commission, or like towards Ukraine. Absolutely, 100. That's a really good point. Well made. Yeah, and I think so. So going back, someone's saying that we're being really biased. We did start off saying that there is, we're being really biased and really pro Ukraine. Actually, let's talk about that a little bit. So, and I've written a big article that's due out in the next couple of days that's looking at this, which is there another side of the coin? I think the title's been changed now, but originally it was something like, is there another side to the coin in this conflict? And the idea that, the IMF got involved. There are all these underhand involvements between vested interests of the West that were kicking around Ukraine in particularly 2013, 2014, that were fomenting the protests, arguably, and that were leading towards that. And then NATO was arguably encroaching, but then, I won't get to the but bits. And the EU is doing what the EU does, and then you're looking at Ukraine and saying, well, is this a really useful ally to have, and sort of cozying up with Ukraine and trying to get Ukraine under the influence? But then, of course, that's going to happen, because Russia's going to be wanting Ukraine under Russians' influence, and Russia was literally pouring in troops to Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, and invaded the sovereign country. Then I know that was after the protests, but there was democracy going on there. At the end of the day, there's been democracy working there validly since 2014, and at no point did they vote in a pro-Russian government, and that they were all legal elections. So, what would you say about the complexity of causality here?
I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? I have no doubt that the West and money is involved in terms of all sorts of politics around the world, in terms of spheres of influence, and that goes on for every nation. It's what the China's doing with its Silk Road. Russia's wanting to keep its influence and its fingers in its pies. The Western elites will be doing the same thing, I'm sure. But the difficulty is, I think the danger is that we lose Ukraine almost as a kind of child over whom parents are fighting a custody battle. At the end of the day, the word you used a minute ago is the key thing, is their autonomy. What do they want? And if it's the case, do we need to settle who is in the right, the West or the East? It's like, it doesn't matter. And maybe even the Ukrainians don't know the full picture, but the point is they should have autonomy to make a decision even if it's the wrong decision, it's their decision to make at the end of the day.
Yeah, so
do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Duda's priest just said this: there was a Russian military base on Crimea. The citizens of Crimea had a referendum. 87% plus voted to leave Ukraine. Actually, so the referendum, if it's the same referendum I'm thinking of, is actually 95%. But the questions were, there was only two questions or two options, and it was like a false dichotomy. It was done with Russian troops there. It was like the worst example of a referendum. In fact, I think it was cited as like, literally,
do you want to leave Ukraine or do you want to join Russia? Sort of thing like that.
Yeah, so it's like, imagine Wales in Britain. Like Wales voted like to leave the UK, right, and join Ireland. Okay, would it be right for Irish troops to come in, you know, before they'd even had a chance to democratically enact that, to say we all want to leave, right? But and this is what we're going to do about it. It's not like the rest of the UK like forcibly stopped them. They didn't even give that a chance to happen. You have a referendum and then you send, you know, the troops were already there. So this is part of the problem with the referendum. The troops were already there, so they're overseeing this referendum. Now, you go to look at the Wikipedia page, it'll give you the history of the polling for this as well. So I would advise looking at that. It's really thoroughly problematic, because when I've seen balanced articles, lookingfair.org wrote an article that says, look, this is not balanced reporting. We've not seen balanced reporting. And then citing all these things, and look, there was a 95% referendum, but then failing to report the referendum in a balanced way, you're being just as hypocritical. So if you want to be balanced, you need to understand how this fits in fairly and objectively. But even then, you can't send troops in to sort that out without letting the whole nation autonomously and democratically sort it out itself. I put this down to, and even if you are blaming the UN and the EU as being part of this, yes, they're causally part of this. But imagine Harry and Jim are on a playground. Harry says to Jim, go and call Victor a rude name, right? So Jim goes, all right, I'll go and call Victor a rude name. Goes up to Victor, calls Victor a rude name. Victor gets out a gun and shoots Jim in the head and kills him. That's an analogy to what I see going on, which is the West going, oh, Ukraine, do this. So Ukraine says, okay, I'm going to do this. And then Vladimir comes in and invades a country. It's like, okay, let's get some balance. But on balance, this is still 95% Putin's fault, or 80%, or whatever. This is, at the end of the day, a sovereign nation has been invaded by a massive army. So even if causality is really difficult to untangle. It's not as one thing doesn't cause one other thing. It's a whole matrix of stuff causing the world at the next point, right? So but you can't say we're going to absolve Putin and his regime from moral responsibility because the IMF did some shady stuff with money and the NATO were being like a bit NATO-ish. It's like, yeah, but Russia was being Russia-ish. Do you know what I mean? It's like, don't simplify this. So Duda's priest, yes, we can get more balance, but don't swing the other way in some kind of false dichotomy.
And there's the danger in balance, isn't there, as well, of kind of assuming, we talked about this before, haven't we, in terms of, like, for example, BBC coverage. Do you give equal airtime to climate deniers just to be seen to be fair if they only represent like 0. percent of the scientists? What proportion do you go on? The number of views out there, or do you go on the strength of the views or the evidence base for the views?
There's a little bit of talk in the chat about whether Putin's an atheist or a Russian Orthodox. It's not important what he personally believes, but there is absolutely no doubt he's using the Russian Orthodox Church as a vehicle to achieve his goals, and he has been doing for a good 10 years plus now. So, like, he's stoking up culture wars. If you think of Pussy Riot and all, as the rise of feminism and LGBT rights are concerned, he has used the church to foment a polarization that moralizes a situation, and then he can then crush those fighting for equal rights. So I would argue it's not important what he personally believes, because I don't know that you could know that.
It was interesting, yeah, because I remember the guy Vlad the other day we watched, I think it was him, was saying actually that he probably doesn't really care actually about it really. I think he's probably just using it, like you say, as a political thing, because he said there's lots of lots of gay, quite high up people within Moscow who hobnob with all sorts of Kremlin officials, and it's perfectly accepted and so on. But I guess there's kind of a double narrative. So at the personal level, that's sort of accepted, but maybe he's using it as a pretext for other things as well. Maybe it represents something about the West in their eyes.
I think when you have such leaders, they will use whatever tools they can to achieve whatever goals and aims that they seek to achieve. And I think it's the whole idea that religion is the opiate of the masses, and some people say, oh, religion is just exists to control people. No, that's not how it works. Religion is co-opted by some people to control other people, but that's not how it arrived, or it's not why it's there. In the same way that the church, like Putin, is an opportunist in this respect, in that a good strategist, which is like exactly like it's been happening in America. You stir up the culture wars, you get that polarization, you control the information as well. So Putin is a massive information control freak, which you can see from what's going on now. But he will use what he can use in order to achieve his aims, and that's he's using the Russian Church, Orthodox Church, big time. In fact, Jack Maturko, who writes with me at Only Sky, has written on his use of the and the New Humanist magazines run some articles recently or in the last few years.
Yeah, and there's some I think there's probably some serious shtick and politics going on within that. There was a whole thing the other day. I think it was like something like 176 Orthodox clergy signed a letter denouncing this fratricidal war, as they called it. But then you've got the patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, I think his name is, which is a bit like, I suppose, the Greek Cyril, who is kind of, I think, as far as I can see, in Putin's pocket. Complex relationship in terms of their history. I mean, during the Soviet era, they were heavily persecuted. So it's a difficult relationship. And then they've been kind of smiled upon in this kind of post-Soviet era. And I imagine Putin's probably using them as I mean, his big thing is this kind of Russian identity. So I guess using orthodoxy in that sense of being distinctly Russian. Vodka would be a better choice, but
Jack Maturko has written on the fact that I think Kiev is supposed to be a really big center for one. It's not patriarchy. What's the word?
Patriarchate.
Yeah, patriarchate. Yeah, so I think Kiev is a really important place for a rival patriarchate, and so there's some machinations to do with
the Ukrainian Orthodox Church went to, I don't know, was it where Constantinople, was it Istanbul, went to the Greek Orthodox kind of centre there and said, kind of, would you mandate us being a kind of official lineage that's separate to the Russian lineage? And they gave them their kind of stamp of approval. So that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has that pedigree in the Orthodox world. Obviously, the Russian Orthodox Church probably doesn't like that.
Yeah. So there's going to be all sorts of things going on with that respect, in that respect. But so I think causality is really difficult it's really easy to oversimplify. And things don't happen in a linear fashion. You can't say this caused this. So what caused the Crimea conflict? You can't say the West caused the Crimea conflict, because at the end of the day, Putin invaded a country and took over a bunch of land. so even if most of the people in that land wanted to be a part of that, well, allow them to exercise that that feeling democratically. Allow that to you give it some chance. But you walked in, then did the referendum, and then like took the control of that area, and then are pouring troops in, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this pushback to say the West are actually largely responsible for where we're at now, is deeply troubling, because yes, there is some causal responsibility involved there, but it's in the way that you would expect, given the Cold War, it's and our history over the last 100 years. But it's not what you think it is. It's not a case of getting Putin off the hook. At the end of the day, he's just amassed one of the biggest hordes of armament and soldiers, and invaded a country. And I'm sorry, that is just not justified.
In terms of thinking a little bit further back into history, so we can think of like the precipitating factors that precipitated the current events, but we could kind of go backwards to kind of what we might call like the predisposing factors. There's that, I'm no historian on Russia, but there's this long history that I'm vaguely aware of Russia feeling this kind of almost excluded sibling on the eastern outskirts of Europe, going back to sort of like Tsar Peter the Great, trying to building St. Petersburg and trying to get in on the act, if you like, of the great European powers. I just wonder, like, when we think back to the kind of the glasnost or perestroika, I never remember which word was the right one, but the whole, whatever you say about Thatcher, I think she was actually pretty good at connecting with Gorbachev. Reagan, Thatcher, and Gorbachev. That you can see, like the smiles and the kind of the warmth of the trust that was built. I think they had kind of ongoing conferences, didn't they, in Reykjavik or something like this, and there was this genuine warming that went on. But did we in the West somehow mess up the beginnings of trust that were built, or did it all go wrong because of problems within Russia itself, that it wasn't able to transition economically and politically from the old era to the new?
Well, you had Afghanistan thrown in there. So actually, Afghanistan took a huge role in destabilizing the USSR. And that was probably a catalyst, if not a huge causal impetus for that. So I mean, these things are pretty complex. I mean, you had Putin, of course, having a chat about even joining NATO. You've had some very interesting times over the years, but at the end of the day, you cannot excuse what has happened to Ukraine. Now, so there are war crimes taking place. I mean, we've got to. So again, to say that the West is to blame for this is a really, it's like victim blaming by proxy or something. It's like, yes, there are problems, and it's not reported, and some of the mainstream media in America, because actually in Britain I have heard some pretty balanced reporting recently, and that's part of my article. But in America, yeah, maybe the mainstream hawkish sort of loving wars as far as reporting going, the mainstream media over there maybe not reporting things in a balanced way, because actually there are a number of American organizations that are complicit in sort of covertly trying to get as much influence in Ukraine as possible. So yes, but then that's understandable. Ukraine is on the border of a threatening authoritarian regime. You are going to want to be doing that. Now, whether this is capitalism being just self-interested, or whether it's being done for more noble reasons, we can argue. But at the end of the day, that doesn't justify attempting to kill a huge number of civilians. That doesn't justify invading a country and basically destroying it. The Ukraine is a breadbasket of Russia, and arguably a lot of the world in the wheat production it has, and a lot of the other goods it produces. And Putin has gone in and effectively destroyed this country and killed, and is still killing, huge amounts of people. This is not justified by the problematic involvement of the West in sort of the capitalism, communism, board game of life.
So looking to the future, what do you think? Do you think there's a point at which, well, let's not speculate on what the West will actually do. Let's look at it more maybe philosophically. If you were Chancellor Scholz or Boris Johnson, let's say, Keir Starmer, whatever, take your pick, you were kind of an influential Western leader. At what point would you be saying enough's enough? We're putting no-fly zone in. We're gonna put troops on the ground. We're going to intervene militarily.
So a couple of things. Great question. A couple of things. Like you said earlier, you said he's achieved the exact opposite of what he wanted to achieve. So given that Putin wanted to achieve Russian dominance geopolitically, he's achieved a strengthening of the EU that Europhiles could only have dreamed of. I mean, this is you've got Viktor Orban, who's ruler of Hungary, who is an authoritarian, horrible, horrible leader. You've got Poland, which is being ruled by the right wing, who are ostensibly quite would and have been quite friendly with the kind of Putins of the world, right? Are now being brought together in this EU unison. So the EU are being united more than they ever have done, I can remember. And NATO is being strengthened to the point that Finland and Sweden are now considering joining NATO, and they are on Russia's border, well, certainly Finland. So, and part of Sweden? I don't know, maybe just, yeah. but so that's worked against him. What an own goal! What a shot in the foot that is.
But it's interesting, isn't it? You think like the EU was formed in the face of that kind of opposition of Russia coming in from the east, and post, just having come out of a war, and people actually understanding the necessity of unity. So maybe it's taken that kind of existential threat to return for people to see the importance of it.
I just want to pick up on this, Dude's priest. He rightly said, Luhansk and Donetsk region welcome the Russian army, or parts of it. And in fact, there are areas they've really struggled to take Luhansk and Donetsk because it's not quite as black and white as you say there. So a bit wrong about all Ukrainians. When I was talking about all Ukrainians, I meant other than the regions that sorry, I should have been clearer. So well done for picking me up on that. But I meant other than the regions that Russia had already put a stake in, put a flag in, which is a Crimea and areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. So when the Russians invaded, no, all of Ukraine wasn't up in arms about that. But the people who weren't up in arms about that were already under Russian influence. I mean, Crimea is already now part of Russia, and Luhansk and Donetsk were declared as independent republics. So if you're listening to Putin, none of those areas are part of Ukraine anyway. So the point is almost moot. What's interesting is actually, I need to look into this more, but I think Luhansk and Donetsk aren't quite as pro-Russian as maybe they were because they've really struggled to move westwards. So they've got stuck there in a way that, so if you look at where their proposed borders of Luhansk and Donetsk are, actually the Russian controlled area now under the Russian army are further east than that. So actually, I wouldn't be surprised if you'd find growing support for Ukraine as opposed to Russia in eastern Ukraine. But I do get the point. Obviously, not everyone was anti-Russia because there were existent nationalists, existent sort of pro-Russian forces and populations. But broadly, and again, this is going to be a sweeping generalization, but most of Ukraine will be deeply anti, and even more so now. If you go and find me a whole bunch of people from Kyiv who are going to be pro-Russian, who aren't saboteurs, who aren't like sent in, but you're not going to find them. Well, most of them have run away, but. So I don't know. I think there's a deal of. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm projecting, or not projecting, if I'm false accusing here, Didier Priest. But I think there's a good deal of. I don't know, swinging the other way far too much. That I did have the word that I was going to say, but I've forgotten it. But I think I think you are maybe a bit more of an apologist here for Putin, not for Putin, but maybe for being a bit. He's showing quite a bit of anti-West. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not a pro. I'm like not a super pro-capitalist guy. Like if you see a huge amount of my writings, I am very, very critical of libertarian free market economics, etc., etc., etc. So where criticism due, and in the piece I've got coming out, I talk about documentaries by John Pilger, The War on Democracy, which talks about America democratically, not democratic, in clandestine operations since 1952, pretty much, deposing democratically elected governments all over South America. Yeah, that's a very interesting documentary to watch. And then Adam Curtis's documentaries like The Power of Nightmares and Bitter Lake, talking about the simplification of good and evil, is too simplified and it doesn't do justice to what's actually going on. So we can simplify about the West being good and the East being evil. That's obviously not the case. But what Putin has done in the last 10 days is as bad as it gets, almost as bad as it gets, short of like, short of mustard gas and nuclear weapons.
To me, the Irish example is almost an equivalent, isn't it? And like, imagine, the UK until literally 100 years ago was in charge of the Republic of Ireland, and if we had a leader now who, maybe make it more recent to the time when they gained their independence, but looking at the Republic gaining its independence and then seeing, for example, one of our opposing nations, I don't know, whoever you want to pick, putting kind of investment into that area and putting troops on the ground, or potentially in the future putting some kind of military alliance in there, and us feeling the sting of the pride to our national ego going on. That to me would be a kind of parallel as far as I understand it, which may be completely misunderstanding what's going on, but that's how it kind of feels to me. It's just about kind of, for Putin, it's about national pride. It's like couldn't give a monkeys about Ukraine or the Republic of Ireland, if you like, but it's just
you're
about
absolutely right. He can't care about Ukraine because he's bombing the hell out of it. Like he can't genuinely, like there are schools and hospitals and historic buildings being destroyed. The people, the very people, are saying, please don't do this, we don't want you to do this, and he's doing it.
That he argues as the motherland of Russia, like the Kiev being like us united people of the Rus, that I think is historically inaccurate anyway, but
yeah, so his actions speak for themselves, which is this is an action over a territory and over a perceived threat from the West and a whole bunch of other things, but it is not about taking Ukraine and returning it to its motherland in some kind of cultural union. That's just not what it's about, because if it was, you wouldn't be destroying its very cultural heritage. It's just, but the sanctions are interesting because they are hurting, because economics does come first. If you want a decent welfare state, if you want a good country with good well-being, with citizens who are educated, you have to have a good economy. And Russia has been sort of dabbling with capitalism in this kind of weird imitation hybrid idea. A little bit of China, a little bit of sort of capitalist social democracies, and it kind of, I don't know, it's been an experiment, but it needs the money, and if the West, I mean the West sanctions, I think he was surprised because the sanctions that happened after Crimea were nothing, right? The sanctions that happen now, if he continues, will even get worse, and like is basically cutting off the lifeblood to Russia, bar maybe China and bar maybe a bit of India as well. So I think, you know, the existential future of Russia is really threatened at the moment.
So looking to the future, I mean, what do you think the risk is, for example, of an escalation of the conflict into wider Europe, and also just thinking about our kind of the mood in Europe, in the West as well, is, you know, we've been largely for a long time now kind of seeing ourselves as kind of post-war. We're done with all that. That's history. Do you think there's a danger, or a danger of there being an escalation of a more warlike mentality catching hold of Europeans, or even, depending on how you look at it, because I'm being maybe biased there, a danger of us not getting engaged and being a bit too Chamberlain-y, when we should be morally, we should be prepared to take action?
No. So he won't go any further than Ukraine, because he can't. He literally can't, because the army is so poor and the armaments are so poor. So what we've learned from this, and watching a bunch of strategists on this, what we've learned is that the Russian intelligence isn't as good as it should be. And we've learned that their army isn't as good as we thought it was, and as threatening as we thought it was. So what they're very good at doing, I think, is producing some really cutting edge technology and saying, look at this. This is what Russia can produce. But actually, that doesn't represent the Russian army. So the Russian army is what you're seeing, by and large, being put against Ukraine, and it's fairly rubbish. And it's also being decimated. So the cost of this war, in terms of armaments and money in general, is going to be massive for Russia, and in dead bodies sent back. And so therefore,
I think so, but is there a risk? And I totally agree with what you said there. I mean, but you've also got conscripts who are fighting, people that are probably going to see as their kind of kinsmen in a way. They're not going to want to be going in and killing people in Ukraine, I doubt. And I mean, obviously that is happening, but I'd imagine for a lot of them, I'd imagine that would be very difficult. It's probably, I don't know, but I'd imagine it's certain groups that are pushing that more than others. The kind of conscript soldiers, I would imagine, are pretty reluctant to get involved in fighting. I don't know. I'm just guessing. But if Putin were to manipulate the situation, I was listening to a guy the other day talking about, you know, if Putin, for example, if there were lots of supplies coming in from, say, Hungary or Poland to support the Ukrainian insurrection and resistance, and then he decided that this was an attack on Russia, and therefore made a cruise missile strike against Hungary or Poland, that then this would to maybe provoke some kind of response from the Poles or the Hungarians, then the Russian army would then be fighting in a different kind of mentality, particularly if there's a kind of, is able to invoke kind of a defense narrative. But then we might be looking at a different situation.
Yeah, I heard a Ukrainian say the other day, really, really interesting thing, which is, you know what we're fighting for. That's pretty obvious, you know. As Ukrainians, you know what we're fighting for. The Russians, they're fighting for nothing. Like the soldiers, like I'm talking about the people on the ground. Like these guys are fighting for their nation, for their pride, for their lives, for their very existence, for their families, for their homes. The Russians coming in, what are you fighting for? You don't know. Most of you thought you were on training exercises. So, and there's a massive difference. But you're right. So if you flip that, the thing is that you wouldn't attack. You just wouldn't. It would just be absolute suicide. I mean, the problem with Russia is they spent an absolute ton of money in the last 20 years redoing their navy, and they've been redirecting a lot of money. And there's some very interesting analyses on exactly what's gone on, who's been in charge of you know, the defense in Russia. But they spent an awful lot of money on a navy, which is broadly redundant, particularly in this theater. but you can't go and start a war with Europe with an army in that state. And yes, they might change, but they would just be absolutely crushed, nuclear aside. Now, what you mentioned is a really important point. So strategically, so what's happened is the northern troops have had really poor supply issues because of trying to get supply. That's why that 60-kilometer convoy is just basically stuck. It's 3 wide. It can't turn around. It can't do anything. They've been blown up at the front, probably blown up at the back a little bit. It's just basically a parking lot, and they can't get supplies. Why are they doing well in the south? So Dude's priest here talks about. I mean, he's very anti. He's putting his showing his cards here because he's talking about Zelensky being a Biden puppet, which is ridiculous because Biden wasn't even in charge, etc., etc., etc. He's saying, where do you get your news from here, Jonathan? You're so wrong about what's going on. Mariupol fell today. Of course, Mariupol fell today. It's completely surrounded. Most Ukrainian cities will fall because the Russian army is massive, but it's not very good. And what's the end game? Like, back to what I mean, it's still a ridiculous. Yes, they will fall because they're bombing the shit out of these cities. Mariupol is an absolute humanitarian crime, right? So I don't know why you're who you're defending here, Dodius priest. Like, I do this priest. Sorry, I don't know who you're defending here, but it seems rather like you're defending Putin, where he has walked in and then they've been shelling the humanitarian evacuees. It's just like, what? Of course Mariupol has fallen. It's on the south, which is so this is what I was going to say. So the north can't get supplies in because of the terrain and supply routes, and they haven't done any thinking about it. They can't really supply from the east because there isn't much there, but they can supply from Crimea, which is why the south is doing particularly well. So the south is been going along towards Odessa to the west, and to the east you've got Mariupol, and Kherson has also fallen. You're going to see that, and that's strategically important because this is a coastline and ports. Odessa is very important because it is a huge historical but also municipal port, right? But that's because they can supply from Crimea. That's why Crimea is so important to Russia. That's why Russia wanted Crimea back in 2014. This is nothing to do with the Crimeans want us. So it's self-determination. Absolute bollocks. And this is where Dude's priest, for example, I think might need to get inside Putin's head. Why did Putin want Crimea? It's got nothing to do with the self-determination of those people and everything to do with the massive strategic importance of having a port on the Black Sea.
And also, I think when you mentioned earlier about investing massively in the Navy, yes, I mean it's got lots of sea around the Arctic, north of Russia and right down the east end, which what do they do there much particularly? I don't know. Most of the Russian population I think are in the west. So what is that about? That to me, that represents kind of trying to look a bit like the US when they sent that aircraft carrier, didn't they, down the North Sea through the Channel, English Channel, round through the Straits of Gibraltar towards Syria and Aleppo. There's almost something about this kind of national, I don't know, this kind of jingoistic thing of trying to we've got this big aircraft carrier. Look, we're being like the Americans. That I suggest is probably what tells you what's going on in terms of the storyline here. It's just wanting to project this sense of being a great power again.
Yeah. And so what I was going to say, which is very taking me too long to get around to what you were saying. So you've got the north, the east, and the south. Okay, let's say Russia takes all of that quite successfully. But as long as you've got the western border to Poland, Slovakia,
and why did he not attack down there? I can't understand. Why did you not put a flank going down the west of Ukraine, blocking off any potential supplies, then pushing in from the east? You don't even need to take Kiev straight away. You can just gradually
because it wasn't an invasion to start with. It was just deposing the government, and because he had to morph and change that on the fly, they weren't prepared for a full-scale occupation. It was just topple the government. The whole country's yours. If you can't topple the government because none of them want you there, apart from the ones that are already pro-Russian, then this becomes an invasion, and then all your people are in the wrong places and are doing the wrong things, right? Because so the West, we're sending in Stingers, right? Stingers and NLAWs and these and the Swedish versions of them, which are like, you know, both anti-aircraft and anti-tank, you know, handheld weapons and manpads to basically destroy, absolutely wreaking havoc on Russian armaments, right? And they're just streaming through the western border. Just you've got and you will have covert operations taking place, I'm sure, as well. So you'll have the West involved in like drone strikes and all sorts, and as the superior Russian air superiority hasn't happened. And interesting, this was on the news today, so this is pretty bona fide. They need more planes because they had quite a few planes hit in some early airstrikes on not taken out of the air, but actually blown up on the ground. And the problem is you can't give them like F-16s and whatnot because they don't know how to fly them. But what you can give them are like Polish and Czech MiGs and Hungarian MiGs. So what they're doing is they're bringing them Russian MiGs that they can fly. And then the Americans are replacing those MiGs in the European nations with F-16s and whatnot. So they're saying, if you give them the MiGs, they can fly them. We'll give you some F-16s and whatnot, and F-19s and all that. So that's quite a cunning thing. But the point is, they can do that because that whole border is free. So they can just give them planes. But what's interesting, and one of the articles I wrote a couple of days ago,
you could even have in fact, you didn't even think about it, you could have a Ukrainian government waiting just the other side of on the Hungarian border, and the interaction going on. You know, just the lack of, it's a nation of chess players. You just thought Putin would have thought about this a little bit harder, wouldn't you?
But yeah, the theory is that he's he's FGB and not a military strategist, and just you get it wrong, and then everyone's in the wrong place doing the wrong thing because it failed. That first thing failed, then you're scuppered, and then you have to rechange everything on the fly. So I think there's also an interesting to move the conversation sideways a little bit. And this is also talking about what you were talking about, like when do, and the reason why this is super important is because Putin said this today, which is like sanctions is basically he was saying sanctions are akin to warfare, effectively saying like sanctions are like you making moves on us. And I think this is an interesting idea because it's a siege.
That's what when we siege cities in ancient Greek times, what is that? Sanctions.
It's a great analogy. The piece I wrote the other day was on cyber warfare, which is to say that Russia was attacking Ukraine before they sent the troops in. They'd spent a month. I mean, this was coming. They knew this was coming. There's lots of evidence to say this was coming because what Putin said something to someone like ages before, and it's come out. So this has been on the cards. This wasn't like we just decided to do this. But they were cyber attacking the Ukraine, trying to take out their banks and all sorts. And my article was asking the question is if you're a country like country Rob, right, and country JP, I sink one of your boats, right, I blow up one of your boats in an outright act of war, right? You retaliate to me. You say, right, you've done something to my navy. I'm going to attack you. We're now at war. You've declared war. But cyber warfare, which can take out hospitals, for example, take out like emergency services and communication, it can cause people to die and cause harm.
Supermarket networks, food supply chains. Yeah,
they took out the energy pipeline in the US. Was it last year or the year before? I mean, it's about plausible deniability, which is like, oh, we didn't do that. Some illegal Russian entity or something. It's like, no, you did that. So, but when does cyber warfare turn into warfare? When are you justified in saying you've just attacked us with, yes, it's with code and whatnot, but you are attacking our national sovereign nation.
Yeah, or we are elections.
We are going to attack you with missiles. There's this blurring between what you can do and get away with doing without being attacked with actual missiles.
Yeah. I mean, the interference in the elections, in the US election, presidential election, and with Brexit.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, does that justify when you justified in going to war? You know, because you see, a just war is justified in particularly in terms of retaliation, right? In like, if you've attacked us, we can attack you, surely. Yeah. But if you're attacking us, not with tanks, but with like code, can we not attack you back with other means? I don't know. It's an interesting. Yeah. I don't know what the answer is. But and the other thing,
is he preparing the ground for making a case for a military attack somewhere?
Well, I mean,
or trying to saber rattle.
Yeah, but what they were saying in the CSIS video, which I'll post a link to, really interesting strategic analysis, which is that phase 2 of the cyber warfare looks like it might well be that if the sanctions bite, Putin will want to exact a price on the West for those sanctions, and one of the ways might well be to cyber attack retaliation the West in general. And then you know, but then that's interesting because where you say you attack one NATO country, you attack them all with tanks and planes. If you're openly attacking NATO countries with cyber warfare, how does that work?
Yeah. And how good will they be? You wonder now, don't you? Because we've had this long kind of mysterious sense of, you know, Russia and the FSB or what have you, and kind of what they've got there and their nuclear attack force and cyber. And then we look at this attack on the Ukraine, which is just like organized by Boy Scouts by the look of it, you know. And you're thinking, well, and they didn't even do that great a job in terms of their cyber attacks on the Ukraine, did they? I think didn't the Ukraine get everything back up and running pretty quickly? And they've been attacking Russia, you know. You think, well, is there just a lot of smoke and mirrors and bluff? You know, what was that scene in the Wizard of Oz, wasn't it, where they you know, where it's like all the noise and what have you, and you nip behind the curtain, it's just this old guy kind of playing on the, you know, not to belittle the fact that obviously they are causing a lot of serious real damage to people in Ukraine right now, but they do nevertheless thrive on trying to project this sense of power. They don't. I mean, the poisonings in Salisbury, for example, you know, there's a kind of mafia. The power, in a sense, relies on this creating this narrative of fear in the opponents, and a capacity of reach, which they possibly don't have. So, bearing in mind, of course, the caveat that they do have a lot of nukes.
Yeah. So very interesting. I think the Salisbury scenario, for those in America that might not know, a couple of years ago, 2 Russian agents came into the UK with perfume that was actually, you know, radioactive poison or whatever, and they sprayed it on the doorknob of these ex-Russian KGB you know, guy, and him and his daughter went out for a meal, and then they basically died in the pizza restaurant, or they died later. But also 2 British people were caught up in this and died. I mean, one found the empty perfume in a wheelie bin and sprayed it on her, and she died, and then another guy died. But the point being is that the Russians came in, and we caught them on camera doing it. So we know it was them 100%. And they came and assassinated people on British soil, and then they went away, and we were like, but what do we do about it? Nothing. Like, so there's Putin saying, do you know what? We can go straight into Salisbury, this lovely little town in the south of England, quintessentially England, and we can murder some people, and we can go back home, and then nothing gets done about it.
And then they released this laughable video. I say laughable in the sense of
it was brilliant. Yeah. Oh, it's hilarious,
ridiculous,
but sad.
Wasn't it? Where they were put on this kind of stage thing of we were just coming to see the beautiful 123-foot spire of Salisbury or what have you. That I mean, it's just ridiculous. But they knew it was ridiculous, and they're almost just sort of like sticking 2 fingers up.
Yeah, these 2 Russian agents that we caught on CCTV back in Russia saying, no, we were there on holiday. We were just really interested in Salisbury Cathedral, and they basically read out the Wikipedia page. They didn't read it out. They said it verbatim. So it's like, it's like all you're doing is repeating. We went to the lovely 143-foot sort of downwards built in, and it's like you are literally, you've remembered the Wikipedia page and you're reading out to your news reporter, and that's you excusing the fact that you came to the UK and you assassinated 2 people. So it's terrible. But the fact is that we were weak in responding to that in the same way that we were weak in 2013 and 2014. And in Litvinenko, another person who was killed with polonium in the UK as well. So it's a classic. If you know, you can't meet things with weakness, because if you meet threats with weakness, then you know what are you teaching the aggressors? Again, Dude is Priest said, I'm not absolving Putin from anything. I feel Putin could have done better just sitting on the border instead of invading, which is interesting in itself. So, yeah, but he did invade, and look at what he's done. So, yeah, he could have done better. Of course, he could have done better. He could have done better by maybe not even sitting on the border and threatening a sovereign democratic nation. I don't know why you'd have to amass 160,000 troops for a country that's just exercising its democratic rights. If they want to join NATO, they can join NATO.
And there must be this element of fear involved, because I think, you think if the only motive, I know I was pushing the thing about this kind of great nation narrative, wanting to kind of revive that earlier on, but you could do that within NATO. You could have a strong Russia within NATO, respected Russia within NATO, or even not in NATO, just being a force for good in the world.
Yeah, I don't know how NATO would work with Russia in it, since its whole raison d'etre is to counter Russia. It's like, it was a bit redundant, but you certainly.
But that would have been a good strategy then, wouldn't it? The best way to make NATO redundant and to take away the threat on the border would be, well, let's just make them redundant. Let's not be a threat. Let's just be. Do you know what I mean? Like a good neighbor.
I just think it's really problematic when we are seeking to justify Putin's decisions. Like, it's like, okay, so the West, the capitalist West, might not have been acting in particularly noble ways for the last 20 years, but it in no way justifies that. And it's still forgetting that the Ukrainians themselves are self-determining or autonomous democratic peoples. So, and yes, like as he says here, is the Azov battalion Nazi? Just curious what you think. So there are elements of, and this is partly what underwrites Putin's claim he's trying to denazify, because there are some Nazi elements, sort of far right elements that have been absorbed into the defense forces as well, and it's a bit of a problem. But then, in the same way that Hungary has problems, that Poland has problems, that the UK has far right problems, we don't go invading them, right? It's like, Viktor Orban is a real threat, I think, to Europe in general, and has some really nasty elements going on in Hungary. But I wouldn't justify sending in 160,000 troops and a bunch of tanks. So the problem, there might be genuine problems, but these aren't the right solutions. And it's something aside, this is completely random, Rob. But what I have noticed, by point of fact, and this is a purely geek, like, there's something in the boyness of my existence that is intrigued with all this, because as a kid you loved soldiers and army and tanks and stuff like that, and I used to get like War Machine magazines and stuff like this. But I look at some of the footage I see now, some of the statistics, and see tanks just getting blown up with relative ease, but with javelins and NLAWs and these like handheld weapons, and you just think, what's the point of a tank anymore? Tanks are redundant. I think this war will be interesting. There are lots of things that are going to come out of this war. We'll learn an awful lot. as macabre and horrible as it is, this is a watershed moment for humanity. But one thing, there will be war strategists that will be looking at this going, well, I don't know that there's any point in spending billions of dollars making tanks anymore, because they appear to be pretty redundant and you can destroy them with relative ease. Like I've seen tanks that the turrets have just popped off, like, because you send in some munitions in there, they get in there, they blow up the munitions inside, and they're just like, tanks appear to be walking death traps. They're getting stolen by the dozen, they're getting blown up by the dozen, they're getting abandoned by the dozen, and they appear to be fairly useless. Drones, on the other hand, are the future of warfare. And, Obama recognized this, and this is probably the weakest part of his rule, is the fact that drone warfare exploded and lots of collateral damage. But then Trump took those figures and blew them out of the water and increased drone warfare even more. But there's a lot to be said for precision warfare. Yes, you are going to get collateral damage, but is it not better than shelling entire cities? I don't know. It's a lot of talking.
Yeah. The whole kind of fascination with war thing's an interesting one, isn't it? And there's probably quite a lot of people out there that,
talk us through that.
I think you're segueing into my post that I put up earlier on. You were kind of just thinking about, it was about Jungian archetypes and the archetype of war. I was just curious, really, thinking about, just how war, sort of really kind of mercurial way, kind of just can sort of subtly and quickly get out of hand. So we might start quite rationally with a sort of real rational calculus of what might be going on, and then there's always that unpredictable aspect of what Putin does or what someone does, and before long the ball's rolling. But also just the kind of reaction. I'm just curious about what might be possible in a society like ours that I suspect in many ways is quite bored. It's hyper entertained, but it's quite bored. You think of like the Romans with the gladiatorial combat. There's something about that sort of martial bloodlust and that kind of. I was looking at an essay written by two guys, I think they're Dutch, in 2010, looking at the reading material of young men in 1913 and in 1933, and in their letters back home, and quite a lot of it was just all the kind of schoolboy adventure heroes and war hero stuff that they've been reading, and they were making the point, that, and this is back in 2010, so it'd be probably a lot more now, that by the age of 18, the average American has watched something like 18,000 killings in films or on video games and so on, which, not to demonize films or video games, but not to say that they're necessarily causative of those things, but they might be indicative of kind of our bloodlust. And there is that element. I just wonder whether humans, I really can't find this quote. I'm sure there's someone that said, if the world was just perfect and if everything was running absolutely smoothly, we will just get bored, and for the sheer freaking hell of it, we would rip it up and cause mayhem and destruction. There is something about that.
One of the arguments against heaven, like philosophical boredom.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I get your point.
Yeah,
and I wonder if this feeds into what you're saying, which is when during disasters, the media, I don't think they delight. I think that's the wrong word, but they get a sense of purpose and get really excited. You think of all the reporters that want to go to these front lines, and this is what this is your raison d'etre as far as a reporter is concerned. This is like the excitement and the 24-hour rolling news. Like the news channels are loving this, which is very sad, because obviously they are showing us destruction and death on a massive scale. And yet, this is great for viewers.
There might be this humanitarian gloss over the top, but there might be this just sheer, wow, that's what's going on. This kind of entertainment, news as entertainment. The gladiatorial combat, happened and that's what was going on there in Rome. And I just wonder if we are a fundamentally very bored society, and that there's something about war. There's a quote I came across, a general pattern where he said something like, I can't remember it word for word now, but it's just saying, There's nothing that compares to war, and God damn it, something like I just love it so much. You know, there is that reported soldiers report that, so euphoria. I mean, we often hear the other stories and the trauma and everything, but there's also that kind of euphoria where you've got the camaraderie, you've got the sheer every visceral aspect of your being that through millions of years of evolution, it's been designed for like hunting and survival. All of that switched on, you know, where you're and also that what you might call like flow states, where you could
What do you
be in
mean
a
by that?
state where
What's the flow state?
where you've got that perfect. And of course, wars, probably kind of wars that we're in now, aren't going to be like that. But you know, there's certainly in people's fantasies of wars, perhaps, you know, that you would, you know, that being in that situation where there's that perfect blend of anxiety, midway between anxiety and calm. So calm's quite closely related emotionally to boredom, just one notch on from boredom. Anxiety is uncomfortable, but just one notch across, and you're in a kind of flow state where, you know, a bit like I described with Jonathan Haidt earlier, they're soldiers in that, they're just in, when you're in the zone, like in the sports, where you're playing a sport and you're just at optimal performance at the highest level of your skill and challenge. And it's almost like your sense of self and time just disappears. And you know, without thinking about exactly how to, you played, what was it, Ultimate Frisbee, wasn't it? You know, when you know exactly how to place that perfect shot at that perfect, your body's almost just doing the thinking for you. So
Funnily
I'd
enough,
imagine war
fun-
brings that
funny,
about for some people.
so, someone mentioned this earlier, saying you're wearing an old school T-shirt there, and it's someone that must know me or must know. So this is an Ultimate Frisbee T-shirt from like 30 years ago. No, 20, 26, 20, 25 years ago. So that's how sad I am. But it's
This is a
also,
jumper from Sainsbury's from 2 days ago. That's much worse.
but I also played a lot of rugby as well, and there's a visceral kind of like, you know, manly, so old school manly, physical engagement, but with that comes a deep camaraderie and even respect for the opposition. And yeah, you know, I think I can see war, you know, doing, you know, being a very interesting psychological thing.
What? And you're kind of in the transcendent zone, because you're about something which is greater than you. You know.
But that's so to link that back topically, that's what's really interesting about that quote from the Ukrainian, which is, we know what we're fighting for, you're fighting for nothing, which is you know, on that personal level. And again, I'm not talking about Putin and the commanders, I'm talking about the people invading, like these conscripts, these young soldiers, or whomsoever it might be, invading because they've been told to. And actually, what's interesting, a lot of commentary on the fact that a lot of people join the Russian army because they get accommodation, they get like an apartment or whatever. So it's not like this yearning to fight for your motherland or whatever. It's like, this is because I can sort myself out and get a, you know,
steady job,
etc., then being thrown into this. And but these guys, on the other hand, are fighting with everything they've got. You know, we've got 66,000 Ukrainians have come back, and foreigners have come back, and probably more now, to join in and say, you know, we're coming here voluntarily to put our lives on the line. That's how much it means to us.
Yeah.
So, what other observations to do with sort of Jungian psychology did you want to make at all?
Yeah, that was it. I mean, in the blog post, which maybe you could put in the link, I think I listed something like 7 levers, or levers, I guess your American audience would call them, that I think are kind of things that trigger this kind of war archetype, or just the way I feel like the way the war maybe even triggers those levers. Things like unity, sense of transcendence, sense of the sacredness of war. I was just curious, just reflecting, just if you look up and down our national churches or war memorials, that sense of the sacredness of war and the memory of the fallen. So that it comes back to the point right at the beginning, you know, that to even criticize a war effort, or to consider criticizing it, might be seen almost as kind of sacrilegious. Yeah.
Yeah,
What else?
yeah. That is really interesting. In like, you know, I think so, and I hope I didn't annoy Do This Priest too much. You know, as if to say, oh, you can't criticize or you can't, you know. It's just not the done thing. Of course, we should always be critical about the motivations of all people involved in any conflict and try and tease out the causality. So I think you're right. You know, I think if you were to start getting you know, media outlets that would be really critical of the West's part to play in this, they would be absolutely like hounded down by people at the moment, because there's such a visceral defense of the Ukrainians. Like, population, everyone I've spoken to in the UK or heard speak publicly about this, almost everyone has been like, you know, so anti-Putin, so anti-Russia. But then again, is that fed by the media itself? You know, I don't know, trying to tease out exactly what's going on. But you know, surely everyone can see the fact that a massive nation, like, we all love underdogs and whatnot, that a massive nation, authoritarian nation, has invaded another sovereign democratic nation who is the underdog. So of course there's going to be. But anyway, carry on with your list.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, it was kind of just looking, I guess, at the way in which war can slip out of control, because it pulls on all these different levers that have got kind of high octane levers, to mix my metaphors, you know. Yeah, the sense of unity, the sense of belonging, being an in-group rather than out-group, the sense of the sacred, the sense of the transcendent, being part of something bigger than myself, you know, having peak experiences if you're in a conflict, or at least people's fantasy of being in a conflict. And that wasn't to take any particular side in this scenario, but just to sort of make us aware of how actually there are forces and drivers within us that can push us to a place very quickly in the right circumstances, which might not be rationally thought through, but might be very, very powerful.
Yeah. You only have to look at Stanley Milgram's experiments and to see, you know, this kind of activity we'd undergo under pressure and you know, under authority. So yeah. I Do This Priest again saying Ukraine is merely NATO's toy. Okay, we'll flip this around. Ukraine is merely Putin's toy. You know, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, pouring money, pouring covert influence into those regions, seeking to use Ukraine as a buffer zone between Russia and either as a buffer zone between Russia and the West, or as part of Russia.
Well, I think I just also had to push back against that as well and say that's kind of objectifying Ukraine as a non-player. It's just a toy. You know, it's like this is the problem. It's like this cuts against the argument being made here in a way, is to say actually what we need to be seeing is Ukraine. You know, if the argument is, oh, NATO is just a toy, we need to be actually making the argument the opposite. They're actually people seeking self-determination. And so if they're people, they're not a toy, not just some sort of instrument of someone else, but they're seeking self-determination, then that's the thing that we should be emphasizing and underlining. And they're not saying they want to go towards Putin, are they?
Yeah. So what Do This Priest is saying here is very similar to there's a radio, quite a balanced piece on the BBC News the other day, which is going to be in my forthcoming article on this, which was Jeffrey Sachs, who's a historian, economist, America, saying actually, you know, it's the West's fault type thing, very similar to Do This Priest, but, you know, dressed up with a little more sort of historical analysis. And then he got another historian in, Garton Ash from Oxford historian, in to say what he's just said is effectively, he might be a very good economist, but he's a very poor historian because he's got this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. And he listed all the things that he basically distorted, and then said you know, exactly what you're saying, which is, you know, at the end of the day, this is what was an interesting observation you made is that you look at what happened after the Warsaw Pact. You look at what happened after all the Eastern European nations left, after the USSR kind of like fell apart. What did they do? They all ran to NATO straight away. They ran to NATO straight away, and they said, "We are afraid of these guys over here. We want to be part of you." He said,
having experienced them for 40 odd years.
Exactly. So his point was, you've got to understand what was going on here. So you can't put NATO as some kind of bad guys and Russia as some kind of good guys here, and say, oh, NATO's got involved and they're encroaching. It's like, you look at what happened when people were freed from them. They ran straight to NATO. So if we allowed that in Eastern Europe, then Ukraine's doing that as well. You know, why is this any different? And surely we should entertain the idea that if they want to join NATO, and actually, funny enough, NATO weren't going to even have them. They weren't going to be accepted by NATO. So this is all part of the narrative as well. I think that Duda's priests have sucked in, which is the idea. And it reminds me of Brexit, when Brexiteers were saying Turkey are going to join. We're going to have 80 million Turks joining the EU. Think of all those Turks are going to come to Britain. Right. And my dad was telling me this, you had the newspapers telling me this. It's like Turkey were never going to join the EU because they failed on all the criteria for joining X, Y, and Z. Now, NATO, Ukraine weren't going to join NATO because NATO were too afraid of exactly what's just happened. They were so it's part of the narrative to say that Ukraine were going to join NATO. NATO wanted Ukraine, and therefore it's NATO's responsibility for starting this. Actually, that is to get wrong exactly what's happened. I don't know.
Yeah, I bet there's all sorts of interesting conspiracy theories going around at the moment.
Yes, exactly. And I think at the very least, what we should do is allow a sovereign nation to dictate its own future.
That's what it comes down to in the bottom line. We don't need to worry about the West or Russia. It's actually what the Ukrainians want.
Yeah. And if Ukrainians want to join the EU and the EU wants them, then rather than seeing this as like Ukraine being used as political football, which may also be part of the point. So it might be that the EU say this would be useful for the EU, and NATO. Yes, exactly. And NATO might go, we might really want Ukraine. But if Ukraine want to join NATO and want to join the EU, that's the most important part of this. And it's the forgetting of the sovereign self-determination of that nation, which I think is a really problematic.
It's like an abusive ex insisting that their once partner doesn't marry their kind of friend that they fell out with at high school.
Yes. So it's all problematic. But I think to a degree, yes, we aren't very good at reporting things in a balanced fashion. But part of that's down to the fact that nuance is so damn complicated, and it's really hard. So if you were to try to accurately report this whole situation to the general public, realistically, you've got to accurately report the last 500 years of history. Do you know what I mean? Particularly the last 100 years of history with Russia, NATO, the US, Europe, and Ukraine, right? If you want to give proper balanced reporting, then you've got to do all that. But we can't do that, or at least, you know, you can go and find that out. But if you're reporting on the news for the general audience, you're going to be taking shortcuts, and things will get simplified. So the nature of news is, unfortunately, in many respects, to simplify very complex features and the very complex nature of reality. But then, you know, hopefully we can educate people enough to be able to say, well, do you know what? You can go and use independent news sources and independent information sources, you know, responsibly, and go and find out your own information. But, you know, that's difficult because people read what they want to read. Yeah, so there you go. You know, and if you want to think that Ukraine is Zelensky is Biden's toy, then, You know, you can go and find information to support that, but I hardly think that is the case. And if Zelensky is Putin's toy, what about all the rest of the Ukrainians? What about all those Ukrainians that are in every single city and town being bombed and blown to pieces? So it almost doesn't matter how we got here. It's like you know, the causality thing. I'm going back to the causality thing. So talk about philosophy here. I once wrote a piece and did a piece in various places about, have I ever killed someone? And I've talked to you about this before, Rob, about, you know, taking a trip of students down to a place in Portsmouth, right? And we walked there all the way from where we were at in Gosport, got the ferry and blah, blah, blah. And we had to walk really fast because we were behind time and we were a bit late. And we had some adult helpers with us who were helping. And one of them kept having to stop for a cheeky cigarette break. And then we pasted it there. We did our trip and then we pasted it back. And we had to really walk really, really quickly on the way back. The children were really exhausted, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, the end of the whole day, it was a success, but, you know, kids and adults were exhausted and we'd walked a long way and really quickly. One of those parent helpers had a heart attack and died that night. So I was like, right, I made all the decisions. We were late because of this and that reason. We had to walk really quickly. I made everyone walk really quickly all the way there and all the way back. And he had a heart attack and died. Was I responsible for killing him? And I thought, well, in some sense, yes, because if I hadn't done that and done this and done that, then that wouldn't have happened and he wouldn't have died. But then I thought, on the other hand, if he hadn't been a heavy smoker and led a really unhealthy life, he wouldn't have had a heart attack. And on the other hand, if he hadn't offered to help out with the trip, he wouldn't have had a heart attack. And on the other hand, if blah, 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 and on the other hand, if humanity hadn't evolved, and on the other hand, if the Big Bang hadn't happened. So causality is hugely complex. And to say that one entity is responsible is really problematic. And again, I'm repeating myself from earlier, but teasing apart that causal relationship between things is so damned difficult. And it's really easy to misunderstand how causality works. And there's this thing, J.L. Mackie, the philosopher J.L. Mackie, came up with something called INUS, conditions for causality, which is to say some things are necessary but insufficient to cause something. So what that means is, imagine a house fire starts, right? And the house fire starts because the gas was left on, someone switched the lights on, and there was loads of fuel in the house, right? Fuel in the house on its own wouldn't cause a fire. Light switch turning on its own wouldn't cause a fire. Gas being left on its own wouldn't cause a fire. You put all of those three things together, causes a fire. What causes a fire? Answering that question is almost impossible. They all cause that fire. So this whole conflict that's just happened and is happening, what's caused it? It's all caused it. But what's more important is who's doing the bad stuff now, right now, and who's the aggressor now, and who's committing the worst crimes right now. Because it isn't Zelensky and it isn't the Ukrainian people. It's Putin and his soldiers. And we've got to remember that. There you go. That's my tuppence.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add in terms of causality? Or
well, the only other thing that I found myself wondering for years about war is thinking about the sort of conscientious objector and what might be called the sort of non-violent resistance movement. I think there have been the Ukrainians who've walked out and literally just stood in front of tanks, and there are sort of people that advocate non-violent resistance active in this. And I think it can be quite remarkably effective. Let's not forget Gandhi kicked the British out of India, in a sense, using non-violent resistance, although I'm sure there was more going on than that as well. But to what extent, like, let's forget Ukraine for the moment. Let's imagine Britain in 1939. You know, we chose to go. I mean, so we're talking about causal responsibility. Like Hitler chose to go to war. You had all the problems in Germany before that. So you had like the Versailles Treaty, economic problems caused by the Versailles. You know, you can look at Imperial Europe and then how Germany was kind of, the Kaiser was jealous of the other imperial powers. All these kind of causal factors going back and back and back and back and back. But if you think of what caused World War II, part of that you could argue was what we chose to violently resist. Could, you know, and I think probably we did the right thing, so I've just put that in there. But could we? Let me put it this way: like in any war, when you choose to engage in a war, there's going to be casualties because you're fighting. There's violence going on. What would have happened if in World War II we'd have just said, "It's fine, okay, run the country, take it over"? You know, would there have been more net good in the long run? Less people killed, less trauma for generations, less stuff that had gone on. I'm going to forget the whole Holocaust aspect. Obviously, that for me would be like that's in itself enough to have gone to war. But let's just park that. Imagine that wasn't part of it. But you know, should a nation ever kind of think about actually what price do we pay for our autonomy? Should we just go, okay, whatever, you know? Because is there do we kind of do a greater evil in the sense by going to war to defend our freedoms and just by going, okay, we'll be run by this bunch of people for a while. History will probably forget them. It will kind of dissolve out in the long run. Over the next 200 years, there'll be someone else that comes along. Their regime will collapse. I don't know. It was just a kind of
really
thought experiment.
Yeah, because I mean, what you're doing is you're talking about. So, I mean, there's different ways of calculating moral consequentialism. So, which moral consequentialism being that the morality of an action is derived from the consequences of that action. So you say, well, actually, if that leads to fewer deaths and greater well-being in the long run, but then of course you're going for predictions that are unknown, and then it's like, are there moral ways to morally value outside of moral consequentialism? So, for example, is there something like different human rights that might obtain moral value, like, you know, or is it just, are we just measuring things in like well-being and pain and pleasure of people? You know, is like freedom and truth and knowledge and all these other things, do they obtain some kind of moral value?
It's a high price we place on autonomy, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to think. Like, would if everyone had just said to Germany, "Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, you go and take over everywhere." But then, what's the worst can happen? Well, if it was like, okay, all the Jews were just exterminated, and then it was like all the next out group, and then it was the next out group. Do you know what I mean? Actually, and then could it have been? And the problem is, you just don't know. And in the absence of really accurate predictive knowledge of the future, I don't know. It's a really interesting. I mean, that's ostensibly what's happening now with Ukraine, and it's really good to hear that on BBC Radio the other day on 5 Live. I was listening to a really good analysis where the one guy said, "Look," and actually, I heard another BBC radio host say this to a Ukrainian directly. Said, "You want a no-fly zone." Now, no-fly zone has to be enforced by NATO, for example, which means that if the Russians fly over Ukraine, we have to shoot. NATO has to shoot them down. And that is World War III. So he challenged the Ukrainians, said, "Look, you want a no-fly zone, but if this is going to cause us to enter World War III, and then 600,000 people are going to die. But I know this is going to sound harsh to you, Mr. Ukrainian, but
yeah,
if we allow 50,000 Ukrainians to die now, and then we get to some kind of solution, or there's 600,000 people dying, and then we get to our solution, what's the better option there? Because it looks like it's letting 50,000 Ukrainians die."
Yeah, and it's like, I remember there was a woman, wasn't there, stood up the other day to Boris Johnson and said, you know, what's going on here, and you're not doing anything, And I was wondering if he turned around and said, well, okay, let's suppose it'd be a bit sort of like not acknowledging the feelings, not reading the room, but, let's just say acknowledged all of that and said, look, I've got to level with you. If we do that, we're probably going to end up with a nuclear war. Ukraine's going to suffer. Everybody else is going to suffer. Do you want to make this 20 times worse than it's going to be? And is that at all morally justifiable? But then you've got things like, okay, I was thinking all the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, would you allow the suffering of one innocent child to allow for the thriving of, whatever number of people? It's like, is there a sense in which, like, you know, let's suppose to fight the war to stop the Holocaust happening, supposing it would have cost a net cost of other human lives of, say, 10 million Germans and Brits and Americans and Russians, but it would have saved 6 million Jews. You know, is there a point in which it's just immoral to do a moral calculus of going, here's the numbers?
Yeah.
Actually, what you need to do is look at, there's a sort of virtue ethics that kicks in and goes, it doesn't matter. It could be one Jew going to the Holocaust. We sacrifice ourselves. You know, it's not about the numbers. It's about who we are as human beings. You know,
really great point. Do I want to be the sort of, again, and also do you factor in autonomy there? So if I'm a troop, if I'm a soldier, and say I want to be the sort of person that would go to the aid of these people, so don't disallow me to be that. Yes, I might be one of the people that might die towards the 10 million that will be more than the Jews die. But if I want to be the sort of person that wants to go and do that to defend these people existentially, then yes, I think it's really there's lots of ways of looking at it. And one of the problems with moral consequentialism, I mean, the problems with, I'm a moral skeptic, so I broadly use moral consequentialism with a bit of psychology to do my morality, acknowledging it that it is somewhat problematic, as all moral value systems are. Now, one of the questions is always, how do you calculate the metric? So if you're looking at moral consequentialism, say, right, it's the most what are we valuing? Is it well-being? How do we equate that? How do we quantify that? But also the more difficult question is, over what time frame? And I often use the example of, like, I could give £20 to a homeless guy, right, and say, there's £20, and it might make him really happy. So in that 2 minutes, that homeless guy, that, wow, changed, what a lovely moral thing. And we're measuring it on his well-being after 2 minutes. And then he buys a cup of coffee, but then he gets some heroin, right? And then he becomes an addict. And then for the next 5 years, he's stealing, blah, blah, blah. And it might be that £20 that caused that to happen. So then we're measuring that over 5 years is really bad. But then he gets
outcomes of your good act. Yeah,
exactly. But then he gets better and then starts up a charity. He learns from this, gets better, starts up a charity that then helps like 60 addicts get off their addiction. And then my 20 quid is now actually,
some of whom turn into psychopathic CEOs.
So how long do we measure moral decisions, and how do we measure them? Or therefore, if it's not on that, is it about the intentions? So if I intend that, so whether or not it produces X or Y is irrelevant. If I give you £20 because I intend you to use this well, and this is out of the goodness of my heart, to, I want you to become better off from having this £20, then that's all that matters. So it depends how you evaluate all of these kind of calculations as to what goes on. Are there any questions from the live chat before we start sort of wrapping this up and let Rob get to bed? Thanks for Canadian Catholic for coming in and joining us. We are coming towards the end. We've sort of jumped around all over the shop. Was there any area, Rob, that you want to talk about that have been playing on your mind, or you think is particularly interesting?
No, not really. I think I kind of covered the aspect I was kind of wanting to bring to the table. Yeah.
So easy, as Canadian Catholic would say, which country's leader is offering salvation, Russia or Ukraine? Otherwise, there's no real way to decide. So what I suppose, that's what I like. So what I take out of this, the question is this is a really nice way. Again, I'm just talking rubbish, top of my head, sort of stream of consciousness. But what I love about this question is, which leader, what does each leader want from the people of the place that he's talking about? So Ukraine. So what does each leader want for the people of Ukraine? And what does that say about the intentions and the moral goodness of Putin against Zelensky? What does Zelensky want here? What are his ultimate goals? what does Putin want of Ukraine and Ukraine's people? Bear in mind, he's killing them, actively killing those people. And bear in mind, Zelensky wasn't actively killing either Ukrainians or Russians, right? So, and that should tell you, I think that should tell you all you need to know about this whole scenario.
Which one's prepared to suffer for his people, or which one's prepared to make his people suffer?
Whoa, Rob, say that again. I love it. I love it.
Which one is prepared to suffer for his people, and which one is prepared to make his people suffer? I
literally just got shivers, Rob. That's, yeah, I've heard you say an awful lot of stuff before, but that's, I think, the greatest thing you've ever said. No, I love that. That's really powerful, and that kind of sums up why, you know, you've got to think of why is it that Zelensky has garnered so much support from so many people around the world. Yes, he's the underdog. That's got to tell you something. Being attacked, but also the sort of things he's saying. What is Putin saying? What is Putin saying that makes you think, yeah, Putin's doing the right thing here? Screw NATO, screw the EU. Putin is right. He's on the money. Putin has said something that makes me feel yes. Yeah, so I'd be interested. Someone like Judas Priest, who is effectively seems to be wanting to cast the West as the villains here. You know, Judas Priest. I would. What is it that Putin has done and said that makes you think, yeah, you're right? What is it that Zelensky's done and said that makes you think, yeah, you're in the wrong, Zelensky? You are truly in the wrong here.
I mean, I can't see Putin becoming the next Che Guevara on socialist T-shirts in the next generation.
And
he hasn't got the face for it, for a start. But anyway,
but I think but there's something to be said for that. Well, you know, there's something to be said for moral intuition sometimes, Rob, which is like, yeah, I morally feel like, yeah, would I put a picture of Putin on my T-shirt? I think it's a lovely way of thinking about this. Like, what's he fighting for?
Just look at the people walking out of the UN. You know, the world's voting on this. Most nations around the world, you know, the guy we listened to the other day said, you know, even the Chinese are going to be embarrassed about this.
Yeah, absolutely. You're getting some love there, Rob, for that statement. That's it right there. Putin would kill them all. Ukraine are better off choosing their own way. Putin is a murderer, and I think that's broadly what it comes down to. Like, we can pick apart the history of this, but the history of this is gone, right? And now people have the power. And when I say people, I mean Putin and his cabinet have the power to stop this, but they're not stopping it, right? You have so you are using these human beings as pawns in your own sort of game of diplomacy here, and that in itself is just is morally abhorrent. Putin says almost nothing meaningful about anything, at least that I've seen, says James. And yeah, I don't think when history looks back at Putin, and yes, we are going to be biased by what our media says about him, but do you really think Putin is a great moral leader? You know, and in this situation, is he showing great moral leadership?
And as what's his name, Vlad Alexei the other day said, you know, this is the sad irony, because this is what he wants. He wants to make a name for himself in history, and he certainly is, but it's not the name that he wants.
Yeah, and I must advise anyone that's watching this, if you're still here, we are just about to head off in a second, so thank you so much for watching. But if you want to check out a really good video that goes into some really interesting analysis of particularly Putin himself, then there's a chap called Vlad Vexler, who is a philosopher who has done a really great take on Putin and what's going on. And
I think he's half Russian, isn't he?
Yeah, certainly has that Russian feel to him.
Government that is corrupt incompetent.
Here it is. Sorry, I don't know if you got any of that sound. So yeah, Rob, thank you so much for your input today. I'm just going to put this in. Here is that video. It's a really good video, well worth the watch. So if you want to check that out, I'd advise you do so. Gives you really a good view into Putin and also what Putin views of Ukraine, and the argument that actually he sees it as a territory, and he's called it a territory, and he uses the language that it is a territory. In other words, this is just a strategic thing. It's nothing more than that. That's well worth watching. This is a terrible time for the people of Ukraine. I just hope things get better, but I can't see it getting better. I think they're in it for the long haul, and there's no off ramp for Putin, and the only way forward is complete destruction, because that's where can you go? Where if there's no point in still being there, because you can't change the government, because there's nothing, you're destroying the country. So if and they're clearly not going to give you the country, and they are fighting you. You've got most of that nation vehemently against you. You can't win the war of hearts and minds here, right? So therefore, what is your end game now? You are not going to get out. That it can be only sort of complete capitulation of Ukraine through destruction, and that's not good. So I don't know what the West can do other than try their hardest to screw over Russia, and sadly use Russian people as pawns in this, economically using them, give them real economic hell, so that the people and maybe some of his cabinet rise up and there's a coup, or there is enough public opinion changing such that he gets deposed. This has been a war of information. Putin is a man who loves to control information. The reason why he's shutting down all those information sources is because this war is being shown for what it is to the Russian people, and he can't have that. Can he keep it together? I don't know. Last thought, Rob. Last thought. Sorry, because I've done a lot of rambling and talking.
Yeah, no, nothing really. Just to keep our wits about us, really, in terms of our own fascination with it, in case it spills over, and keeping our heads screwed on, really.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to write down what you said at the end, because I've forgotten it already, Rob. The previous statement that I thought was so wonderful. That's in nature of my brain these days. Good old MS. Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you for all you guys who watched, who stuck it through 2 hours and 16 minutes of us rambling on and analysing the Ukraine-Russia conflict. There are so many great sources out there to find out information on this, but as we've been trying to talk about, it is wise to try and get as balanced a palette of information as you can without sort of falling into the trap of swinging completely one way rather than the other, as we can all do. Hopefully we haven't been too overtly pro-West. There are failures of the West. There are failures of modern Western capitalism. That go and watch A War on Democracy if you want to see American democracy being distinctly undemocratic, but it doesn't excuse what Putin has done, and I think that's the takeaway point for me anyway. Cool beans. Okay, well, look, thank you, Rob. Thanks for being a part of this. You take care, and thanks everyone for listening and for all your support. You take care, and we'll see you soon.